Negotiation represents a fundamental competency in both professional and personal domains, particularly in Canada's diverse and multicultural business environment. This lecture examines the dual nature of negotiation processes, exploring both the cognitive strategies and emotional intelligence required for successful outcomes. In the Canadian context, where relationship building often takes precedence over purely transactional approaches, understanding these dual dimensions becomes particularly crucial. The Canadian business landscape presents unique challenges that demand a sophisticated understanding of negotiation dynamics. From Indigenous land claims to international trade agreements, Canadian negotiators must navigate complex cultural, legal, and economic considerations. This presentation will analyze how successful negotiators in Canada balance analytical rigor with emotional intelligence, creating sustainable agreements that respect both economic objectives and relational values. Particular attention will be given to how Canadian negotiators adapt their approaches across different contexts, from corporate boardrooms to government policy discussions. The content draws from both theoretical frameworks and practical Canadian case studies, providing actionable insights for professionals operating in Canada's diverse business environment. Negotiation theory distinguishes between two fundamental dimensions that shape all negotiation processes. The cognitive dimension encompasses the strategic, analytical aspects of negotiation, the systematic planning, option evaluation, and tactical decision-making that characterize effective negotiation. This includes the development of negotiation strategies, the assessment of alternatives, and the calculation of potential outcomes. The emotional dimension, by contrast, focuses on the relational aspects of negotiation, the establishment of trust, the management of interpersonal dynamics, and the cultivation of long-term relationships. In the Canadian business context, this emotional dimension often carries particular weight, as Canadian business culture tends to prioritize relationship building and mutual respect in commercial interactions. Successful negotiation in Canada typically requires a sophisticated integration of these two dimensions. Negotiators must simultaneously engage in rigorous analysis of their positions while remaining attuned to the relational dynamics at play. This dual focus enables Canadian professionals to achieve outcomes that satisfy both immediate objectives and long-term relationship goals. Effective negotiation begins with comprehensive preparation, a cognitive process that significantly influences negotiation outcomes. The preparation phase involves several critical components that Canadian negotiators must carefully consider. First, negotiators must clearly define their objectives and priorities. In the Canadian context, this often involves balancing economic goals with relational considerations. The establishment of clear objectives provides a framework for evaluating potential agreements and making strategic decisions throughout the negotiation process. Information gathering represents another crucial cognitive component. Canadian negotiators must collect and analyze relevant data about the negotiation context, the other party's interests, and potential alternatives. This analytical process enables negotiators to develop informed strategies and make evidence-based decisions during the negotiation. Emotional intelligence plays a particularly significant role in Canadian negotiation contexts, where relationship building often takes precedence over purely transactional approaches. The concept of emotional intelligence in negotiation encompasses several key competencies that contribute to successful outcomes. Self-awareness and self-regulation enable negotiators to manage their own emotions effectively during potentially stressful interactions. This self-management capacity proves particularly valuable in high-stakes Canadian negotiations, where maintaining composure can significantly influence the negotiation climate. Empathy and perspective-taking represent equally important competencies. The ability to understand and appreciate the other party's position facilitates the development of creative solutions that address mutual interests. In Canada's multicultural business environment, this capacity for perspective-taking becomes especially crucial for bridging cultural differences and finding common ground. The Canadian negotiation landscape presents unique characteristics that distinguish it from other national contexts. Canada's multicultural business environment demands particular sensitivity to cultural differences in negotiation styles and expectations. Professionals must develop cultural intelligence to navigate these diverse contexts effectively. Indigenous negotiation approaches represent a particularly important consideration in the Canadian context. These negotiations often involve complex historical, legal, and cultural dimensions that require specialized knowledge and sensitivity. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings have significantly influenced contemporary approaches to Indigenous negotiations in Canada. The Francophone-Anglophone dynamic adds another layer of complexity to Canadian negotiations. While language differences present obvious challenges, more subtle cultural differences in negotiation styles and expectations also require careful navigation. Quebec's distinct legal and business culture within Canada creates additional considerations for negotiators operating in this province. Effective preparation stands as the foundation of successful negotiation, particularly in the complex Canadian business environment. The preparation phase involves several critical components that Canadian negotiators must carefully consider. Information gathering represents the initial and perhaps most crucial preparation activity. Canadian negotiators should collect comprehensive data about the negotiation context, the other party's interests and constraints, and potential alternatives. This information forms the basis for developing informed strategies and making evidence-based decisions during the negotiation process. The development of a best alternative to a negotiated agreement, BATNA, provides negotiators with a crucial reference point. A strong BATNA enhances a negotiator's power position by providing a viable alternative should the current negotiation fail to produce a satisfactory agreement. In the Canadian context, where relationship preservation often takes precedence, the development of a strong BATNA must be balanced with relational considerations. Negotiation theory distinguishes between two fundamental strategy types that negotiators employ in different contexts. Distributive negotiation strategies focus on claiming value, typically in situations where the parties' interests directly conflict. These competitive approaches aim to maximize one's own outcomes, often at the expense of the other party. Integrative negotiation strategies, by contrast, focus on creating value through collaborative problem-solving. These cooperative approaches seek to expand the overall benefits available to both parties by identifying mutually beneficial solutions. In the Canadian business context, integrative strategies often prove more effective, as they align with Canada's cultural emphasis on relationship building and mutual benefit. The selection of appropriate strategies depends heavily on the negotiation context. Canadian negotiators must carefully assess the situation, the parties involved, and the nature of the relationship to determine the most effective approach. This strategic decision-making process requires both analytical rigor and emotional intelligence to achieve optimal outcomes. Effective communication represents the cornerstone of successful negotiation, particularly in Canada's diverse business environment. Active listening stands as perhaps the most crucial communication skill for Canadian negotiators. This involves not merely hearing the other party's words, but truly understanding their underlying interests and concerns. Effective questioning techniques enable negotiators to gather crucial information while simultaneously demonstrating engagement with the other party's position. Open-ended questions prove particularly valuable in the Canadian context, as they encourage dialogue and relationship building. Persuasion strategies must be carefully adapted to the Canadian business environment. Direct, aggressive persuasion tactics often prove counterproductive in Canada, where a more collaborative approach typically yields better results. Canadian negotiators should focus on presenting logical arguments supported by evidence while maintaining a respectful and cooperative tone. Power dynamics significantly influence negotiation processes and outcomes, particularly in the Canadian business context where hierarchical structures often exist alongside collaborative cultures. Several sources of power typically come into play during negotiations, each requiring careful management. Positional power, derived from one's role or status within an organization, represents one common source. In Canadian organizations, this type of power must be exercised judiciously to avoid damaging relationships. Informational power, stemming from access to or control over valuable information, proves particularly important in knowledge-based industries prevalent in Canada. The ethical use of power represents a particularly important consideration in Canadian negotiations. The exercise of power should always be tempered by considerations of fairness and relationship preservation. Canadian negotiators must be particularly attuned to how their use of power affects the negotiation climate and potential for future collaboration. Conflict resolution represents a critical competency for Canadian negotiators, who often face complex disputes requiring sophisticated management. The initial step in effective conflict resolution involves accurately identifying the nature and sources of the conflict. This diagnostic process enables negotiators to develop targeted strategies for resolution. De-escalation techniques prove particularly valuable in the Canadian context, where maintaining positive relationships often takes precedence over immediate conflict resolution. These techniques involve reducing emotional tension and creating a more constructive negotiation climate. Canadian negotiators should be particularly attuned to cultural differences in conflict expression and resolution preferences. Mediation approaches offer another valuable conflict resolution strategy, particularly for complex disputes in the Canadian context. A neutral third party can often facilitate communication and help the parties identify mutually acceptable solutions. Canada's multicultural environment makes mediation particularly valuable, as mediators can help bridge cultural differences in conflict resolution approaches. Ethical considerations permeate all aspects of negotiation, with particular significance in the Canadian business environment where trust and reputation carry substantial weight. Several ethical frameworks guide negotiators in making principled decisions throughout the negotiation process. The Canadian business context establishes specific ethical standards that negotiators must observe. These include principles of fairness, honesty, and respect for all parties involved in the negotiation. Canadian negotiators must be particularly attentive to potential conflicts of interest that could compromise their ethical obligations. Transparency represents another crucial ethical consideration in Canadian negotiations. While strategic information management forms part of effective negotiation, Canadian business norms typically expect a reasonable degree of openness about key negotiation parameters. This transparency builds trust and facilitates more productive negotiations. Cultural sensitivity stands as a particularly crucial competency for Canadian negotiators operating in one of the world's most multicultural business environments. Canada's diverse population creates a negotiation landscape where cultural intelligence often determines success. Indigenous cultural protocols represent one particularly important area of cultural sensitivity. These negotiations require specialized knowledge of historical contexts, cultural values, and appropriate protocols. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings have significantly influenced contemporary approaches to Indigenous negotiations in Canada. The Francophone-Anglophone dynamic adds another layer of cultural complexity to Canadian negotiations. While language differences present obvious challenges, more subtle cultural differences in negotiation styles and expectations also require careful navigation. Quebec's distinct legal and business culture within Canada creates additional considerations for negotiators operating in this province. Negotiations with Indigenous peoples in Canada represent a particularly complex and sensitive area requiring specialized knowledge and approaches. The historical context of these negotiations, including the legacy of colonialism and residential schools, significantly influences contemporary negotiation processes. Cultural protocols play a crucial role in Indigenous negotiations, demanding respect for traditional values and practices. Canadian negotiators must familiarize themselves with appropriate protocols for engagement, which may vary significantly between different Indigenous nations and communities. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's findings have established new standards for Indigenous negotiations in Canada. These principles emphasize respect, mutual understanding, and the building of nation-to-nation relationships. Contemporary approaches to Indigenous negotiations must incorporate these principles while addressing the practical realities of resource development and land use agreements. Government negotiations in Canada present unique characteristics and challenges that distinguish them from private sector negotiations. The policy development process typically involves multiple stakeholders with diverse and sometimes conflicting interests, requiring sophisticated negotiation strategies. Regulatory negotiations represent a particularly complex area of government negotiation. These discussions often involve balancing economic development objectives with environmental protection and social considerations. Canadian negotiators in this context must navigate intricate legal frameworks and political considerations. Public-private partnerships have become increasingly common in Canada, creating new negotiation dynamics. These arrangements require careful balancing of public interests with private sector objectives. Successful negotiation in this context demands creative problem-solving to develop agreements that satisfy both public accountability requirements and private sector return expectations. International trade negotiations represent a crucial area of Canadian economic policy, with significant implications for business operations. Canada's trade priorities have evolved considerably in recent years, reflecting both global economic shifts and domestic policy objectives. The renegotiation of NAFTA into the USMCA provided valuable lessons for Canadian trade negotiators. This process demonstrated the importance of maintaining strong relationships with key trading partners while protecting national interests. The agreement's provisions on dispute resolution mechanisms offer particularly relevant insights for Canadian businesses engaged in international trade. Canada's negotiations with the European Union and Asian markets present different challenges and opportunities. These negotiations require careful balancing of market access objectives with regulatory alignment considerations. Canadian negotiators must develop sophisticated strategies to navigate these complex international trade discussions successfully. Labor negotiations in Canada operate within a distinct legal and cultural framework that shapes the negotiation process. The collective bargaining process typically follows established patterns while allowing for contextual adaptation based on the specific industry and regional considerations. Union management dynamics in Canada have evolved considerably in recent decades, reflecting broader economic and social changes. Contemporary labor negotiations often involve complex discussions about workplace flexibility, technological adaptation, and changing benefit structures. Wage and benefit negotiations remain central to Canadian labor discussions, though the context has shifted considerably. Contemporary negotiations must balance immediate compensation concerns with longer-term considerations about job security and career development opportunities. Successful labor negotiators in Canada must develop creative solutions that address both economic realities and worker aspirations. Emerging trends in negotiation practices promise to significantly influence Canadian business operations in coming years. The digital transformation of business processes has already begun reshaping negotiation dynamics, with virtual negotiations becoming increasingly common. Remote negotiation presents particular challenges and opportunities in the Canadian context. While technology enables negotiations across Canada's vast geography, it also requires adaptation of traditional negotiation techniques. Canadian negotiators must develop new competencies in virtual communication and digital collaboration tools. Artificial intelligence applications are beginning to influence negotiation processes in several ways. AI-powered analytics can provide valuable insights into negotiation patterns and potential outcomes. However, the human elements of negotiation remain crucial in the Canadian context, where relationship building often determines success. Artificial intelligence technologies are increasingly influencing negotiation processes, offering both opportunities and challenges for Canadian negotiators. Data analytics applications can provide valuable insights into negotiation patterns, potential outcomes, and optimal strategies. Predictive modeling represents another valuable AI application in negotiation contexts. These tools can help Canadian negotiators anticipate potential responses and develop more effective strategies. However, the human elements of negotiation remain crucial in the Canadian context, where relationship building often determines success. Natural language processing technologies offer particular promise for analyzing negotiation communications. These tools can identify patterns in language use that may indicate underlying interests or potential areas of agreement. Canadian negotiators should consider how to integrate these technological advancements while maintaining the human elements crucial to successful negotiations. This case study examines a successful negotiation between an Indigenous community and a resource development company in northern Canada. The negotiation context involved complex historical, cultural, and economic considerations that required sophisticated management. The key challenges included bridging significant cultural differences in negotiation approaches, addressing historical grievances, and developing an agreement that balanced economic development with environmental protection. The negotiation team employed several innovative strategies to overcome these challenges. The outcomes included a benefit-sharing agreement that provided economic opportunities for the Indigenous community while enabling responsible resource development. This case offers several valuable lessons for Canadian negotiators, particularly regarding the importance of cultural sensitivity and creative problem-solving in complex negotiation contexts. The renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement into the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement provides valuable insights into contemporary trade negotiations. This complex negotiation process involved balancing multiple national interests while maintaining crucial economic relationships. Key issues addressed included market access provisions, dispute resolution mechanisms, and regulatory alignment considerations. The Canadian negotiation team employed several sophisticated strategies to achieve favorable outcomes while preserving the crucial trading relationship. The final agreement included updated provisions on digital trade, intellectual property, and labor standards. This case study offers important lessons about the challenges and opportunities in contemporary trade negotiations, particularly regarding the balance between national interests and international cooperation. This case examines a complex negotiation in Canada's healthcare sector involving multiple stakeholders with diverse interests. The negotiation context included government representatives, healthcare providers, and patient advocacy groups, each with distinct priorities. The key challenges involved balancing budgetary constraints with quality of care considerations, addressing regional disparities in healthcare access, and developing sustainable funding models. The negotiation team employed several innovative strategies to navigate these complex issues. The final agreement established a new funding formula that addressed immediate budget concerns while providing for long-term healthcare system sustainability. This case offers valuable insights into multi-stakeholder negotiations in complex policy environments, particularly regarding the importance of creative problem-solving and stakeholder engagement. This case study analyzes a complex environmental policy negotiation involving government, industry, and environmental groups in Canada. The negotiation context included significant differences in priorities and values among the stakeholders, creating substantial challenges. The key issues involved balancing economic development objectives with environmental protection requirements, addressing regional disparities in policy impacts, and developing enforceable regulations. The negotiation team employed several sophisticated strategies to bridge these differences. The final agreement established a phased implementation plan that balanced immediate environmental protection measures with long-term economic considerations. This case provides important lessons about negotiating complex policy agreements in Canada, particularly regarding the need for creative solutions that address diverse stakeholder interests. Regarding the list of references, as shown here, Fisher, Urey, and Patton's seminal work provides foundational principles for interest-based negotiation that align well with Canadian business culture. The book's emphasis on separating people from problems resonates particularly in Canada's relationship-oriented negotiation environment. Lewicki, Saunders, and Berry offer a comprehensive overview of negotiation theory with particular relevance to Canadian business contexts. The text's coverage of both distributive and integrative approaches provides valuable insights for navigating Canada's diverse negotiation landscape. Thompson's work specifically addresses the dual nature of negotiation examined in this presentation, making it particularly relevant to our discussion of cognitive and emotional dimensions in Canadian negotiations. The Government of Canada's guidelines on Indigenous consultation represent essential reading for understanding negotiation in this unique Canadian context. These guidelines demonstrate how negotiation principles must be adapted to specific cultural and historical considerations. Finally, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's Best Practices document provides practical, Canada-specific advice that complements the theoretical foundations presented in this lecture. Thank you for your attention.